Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our second of four programs on what we need to now take in after the disclosure process has begun concerning UFOs and UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. Today, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty. Evidence concerning alien spacecraft and what they call biologics or extraterrestrial biological entities. This is where it all gets real. There's been much speculation, much conjecture, but when you get down to actual hard evidence of retrieved spacecraft and retrieved alien bodies, you get to the level of incontrovertibility, evidence that is undeniable in its import. And as we begin this discussion, I think it's very important for us, as we get very granular today, to also hold the enormity of the implications of the evidence that we're going to be made aware of. This is arguably the second Copernican revolution. The first one taking place about 500 years ago after Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, provided, again, incontrovertible evidence that not only was the Earth not the center of the universe, but neither was the sun around which the Earth revolves. But we humans still harbored the secret conviction that while our planet and our solar system may not be central, certainly we are. That we humans are special creations and we're at the apex of whatever it means to be life. And now we're being shown evidence again that will radically transform our worldview, just as fundamentally as Copernicus did 500 years ago. That we are not the apex of the food chain of life, that there are in fact alien civilizations and alien beings using technology that we can't even imagine with 21st century physics that are visiting our planet and demonstrating capacities that at this point seem almost miraculous. So as we take in this second lecture by Richard Dolan, the great historian of UFO matters, particularly since the Second World War, as codified in his many books, in particular, his 2-volume work on UFOs in the national security state. Let us hold the immensity of this moment and the kinds of implications that all of us have to work out at the level of politics and culture and science and religion about we are, like a scheme of things as we alien beings from far, far away, both spatially and dimensionally. So thank you, everyone, for joining Humanity Rising. And now it's my pleasure to bring on Richard Dolan to give us the second of 4 lectures. Richard, you were really brilliant yesterday. Thank you so much. We got rave reviews from all over. So we're all very excited about your lecture today. So
Thank
welcome.
you, Jim. Thank you very, very much. I enjoyed being here yesterday. I'm very happy to be here today as well. And I'll just add your introductory remarks about a kind of Copernican revolution in where we are at in the UFO, UAP arena. I think it's quite apropos. And So there might be a little bit of a psychological shock for some to think, well, we're not the apex. Maybe we're not, but we can see that we are still part of an intricate chain and web of wow, of interstellar life. How about that? That's pretty interesting as well. So not a bad thing. So I have a follow-up. This is my second of the four lectures that I want to offer for this kind of overview of the UFO or UAP phenomenon. And I'm going to be talking about the reality, or let us say the evidence for the reality of crash retrievals of UFOs or UAP. So that's on the agenda for today. And by the way, tomorrow I will be kind of staying on that theme, but looking at it in another way and trying to get a sense of the program behind the scenes, mostly corporate, that is engaged in creating that technology. That really hasn't information, but we have some, and I do want to discuss that. But for today, I want to go over the basic case of UFO crash retrievals. So got a couple of simple screens here. I put this lecture together last week. So some of the visuals are not there. You can see I've got a pretty straightforward title page there, but that's what we're going to be talking about, the retrieval of technology and biologics. And I just want to start out by reminding those of us who may have forgotten that for the first, let's say 30 years, 3 decades after Roswell, crash retrievals were not part of any significant conversation in the UFO community or in the public realm, really, in any way. It just wasn't something that was considered viable. The Roswell event happened. There was the great newspaper headline of the Roswell Daily Record. Everyone in the world has seen that. And then it was debunked the following day. It was denied, actually, within hours. But then the next day, the newspapers came out and said, no, weather balloon. And that was the end of that. Now, a couple of years later, there was a book that was published by a man named Frank Scully. And yes, I think on the X-Files, Dana Scully's character, I think that was an homage to Frank Scully, pretty sure. But Frank Scully wrote a book in 1950 called Behind the Flying Saucers. And that was actually, he wrote that even before Donald Kehoe, who's very well known, wrote his first book. Scully wrote the first full-length book published in the United States, as far as I know, on UFOs. And actually, it's kind of an interesting book. Scully was a pretty good writer, but what he did here was he discussed what later became known as the Aztec UFO crash. That was of the spring of 1948. I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't have, but he writes this book, and it almost immediately, gets utterly panned and debunked. And this is not a story that I'm really prepared to go into today with you, but I will say the author of that article, named Bob Considine, was someone who really had it in for Frank Scully. And in fact, some very good work on this was done in the Aztec crash by researchers Scott and Susie, wonderful human beings, which they are, but excellent researchers on Aztec. And I don't, you could look up their book. It's absolutely worth reading. They get into the evidence on Aztec. They get into the whole motivations behind the scene to debunk Aztec. But for our purposes here today, it's just worth noting that, after Roswell was put to bed, essentially, and after Scully's book was thoroughly trashed and debunked in the media in the early 1950s, no one was talking about crash retrievals of UFOs. It was considered so far out, so beyond the pale. Like, serious UFO researchers would never consider this. It was ridiculous, particularly in the late 50s and the early 60s. But the reality was, behind the scenes, there were serious researchers who were still occasionally getting information that led in this direction, that maybe the U.S. military did acquire some alien hardware. So it never really fully went away. But it was also one of these things, and we see this culturally all the time throughout decades. There are certain matters that people are just afraid to talk about. They're afraid of the ridicule. They're afraid of the social stigma. And in the UFO community, crash retrievals occupied that place, as did also abductions for a long time. I'm going to talk a little bit about abductions in the fourth lecture, so I'll come back to that. So anyway, that's what happened with crash retrievals. They kind of went away, and it was not part of the conversation whatsoever. And then we get this man here, Leonard Stringfield, who is definitely, look, if there's a UFO researcher idol that I personally have, it might be this man right here. Leonard Stringfield, to me, is just absolutely amazing. He was a fantastically meticulous and clear writer. That book that I have indicated on the top, UFO Crash Retrievals, that is a collection of all of Stringfield's, what he called his UFO status updates. So his status reports 1 through 7, which went from the late 70s, you see there, to 1994 when he died. It's the 8.5 by 11 book. It's very big. And it's, I think, over 400 pages. If you want some good, deep, late night reading on the UFO subject, you could probably not do better than that book. I think it's great. But however, in 1977, what Stringfield published was the book that I have indicated on the bottom here, called Situation Red, the UFO Siege, he called it. And just a real quick thing about Stringfield, he was an active UFO researcher in the 1950s. He had fought in the Second World War. He'd had a Foo Fighter encounter during the Second World War over in the Pacific, as a matter of fact, which he wrote about. And quite interesting, incidentally. An object, this is after the fighting had stopped, after the bombs had dropped over Japan, but there was still U.S. military activity. And he was flying, I think, out of Iwo Jima. And he said there was this bright teardrop-shaped flaming thing that came next to their plane that caused the aircraft to sputter. The engine was failing, and they were preparing to bail out of the aircraft when the object moved away from them, and they regained all the engine capabilities of the aircraft, and they were okay. So a close call there for Stringfield. But I think that triggered his interest. Through the 50s, he was quite active. Then I think became a little less active during a lot of the 1960s, but kind of rejuvenated. And in the 70s, he gets back into it, and he writes this book. And in this book, he spends a little bit of space, maybe less than 20 pages, on the rumors of UFO crash retrievals. So we have to go all the way to the late 1970s before this subject is raised. This is before people were even talking to Jesse Marcel of Roswell's crash. Stringfield, he talked a little bit about a crash that occurred in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. That was due to the research of Ray Fowler, who's still with us, by the way, and an amazing man. But Stringfield writes about this, and then he gave a lecture. He lived in Cincinnati, so not far from Dayton, Ohio. That's U.S. Air Force headquarters. And he gave a lecture as an ex-military guy himself, but he's also into the UFO subject, and he has people attending this lecture. And at the end of it, a military man comes up to him, retired, I think, and comes up to him and says, "I've got a story for you." And this began Stringfield's journey to acquire firsthand accounts of UFO crash retrievals, and which pretty soon morphed into or included stories of acquisition of dead alien bodies. And so through the late 70s, through the 1980s, and until his passing in 1994, Leonard Stringfield collected well over 100 of these accounts, and they are fascinating reading. Again, I recommend it. I'll come back to Stringfield in a moment. The other book that I just want to bring to your attention, this is a book that was just sent to me by Ryan Wood, a good friend of mine and a colleague. Ryan, this is the second and will be the expanded edition of his absolute classic work on crash retrievals called Magic Eyes Only. It is almost available for sale. I think it will be out very soon. And what Ryan did in this book is just remarkable. This book had been out of print for way too long, so I'm really happy that it will be back out. But he goes over, at least in the first edition, he had about 75 potential cases of UFO crash retrieval. The expanded edition has a little bit more. I've read this book very carefully, I have to say. So in the first edition of the book, he had his own scale of how reliable are these cases? Can we be confident about the fact that they really happened or not? And in the first edition, he had about 17 of the 75 cases that he rated as above average that they actually happened. In my reading of these cases, I think he's a little bit too tough on a number of them in there. It's my opinion. You can buy your copy of the book and decide for yourself. But it's interesting because when you hear, in the last year, we've heard claims of as many as a dozen instances of UAP crash retrievals, if you've been listening to the conversation in the last year. And to some people, they thought, well, my goodness, that's a lot of crash retrievals. But it's really not if you go over the deep research into this matter. You look at a book like Ryan's or the work of Leonard Stringfield's, and you start to think and realize that there's actually quite a few really credible cases that are in there. This is I put this together a few days ago. I was just thinking to myself, what are the cases that to me resonate as very probably happening as the result of exotic technology? It's one or two of these where even I'm not 100% sure if it's exotic tech. You can look at the Kecksburg case of 1965. There are arguments that what happened there is in Pennsylvania might not have been an alien craft, and we can certainly acknowledge that possibility. On the other hand, even with Kecksburg, there are some very interesting cloak and dagger machinations that went on behind the scene in the retrieval of that object, and it did indeed seem very exotic to the few people who are able to come, who later came out and discussed it. So I think we should include that as a potential retrieval of ET tech, whether we know that or not for sure. The Italian incident from 1933 is one of these things where it took me personally a long time before I began to give that case some credit, but I think that we really must give it some credit. This is due to the research of the excellent Roberto Pinotti of Italy, who really has looked into this case in great detail, has pulled up documents from the Mussolini era that do very much seem to speak to a retrieval of something highly exotic in northern Italy at that time. In Cape Girardeau, I'll come back to that in just a moment, so I'll just leave that. Roswell, I'll leave that. Aztec is a case that deserves its own full lecture and has received that many times. But suffice to say, this is March of 1948, very close to the Four Corners area out in the Southwest. And in my view, I have strongly come to the opinion that Aztec was a legit UFO retrieval. It's important to say that, in my view, because the fact is that even when I was relatively new in the UFO field, a little over 20 years ago, it was still very common for the experienced high-level UFO researchers of that time. Stanton Friedman was still not fully had come around to the reality of Aztec. He did after that, I believe, but it took a lot of people a long time. And I think a lot of that was the remnant of the vicious trashing of the case that had taken place decades earlier. I really do think that a lot of researchers were just kind of gun shy of Aztec. But thank goodness for Scott and Suzanne Ramsey and some good researchers before them as well, who looked into the Aztec case to kind of resuscitate it. An event in Del Rio, Texas in 1950. I really won't be able to get into the details of most of these. Kingman, Arizona, I think a very strong case. Las Vegas, 1962, was covered in a very fine book by the researcher Kevin Randall. He did a book on UFO crash retrievals and talked about this case, and I think made a very strong argument that an object zoomed across the United States at ultra high speed from the east going toward the west, triggered the attempted intercept of multiple Air Force bases during its travel, did a temporary landing, lifted up, and then crashed not far from Las Vegas in 1962. It's a fascinating case. And he actually made a very good argument that in the Project Blue Book records and the Air Force records on this, that they were very intentionally, deceptively labeled as two separate events. It's fascinating. The Berwyn Mountains are in the United Kingdom, out in Wales, and in 1974, it does really seem as though a very exotic object came down. Nick Redfern, I know, did a really good bit of analysis on this in one of his books. Bolivia, 1978, I'll just point out, this is something in which we have United States documentation indicating that something exotic and unusual went down in the mountains of Bolivia at that time. And that, I'm talking about the language of the U.S. documents that we have, brought in a UFO connection to that. U.S. personnel went to Bolivia to take control of that operation. We don't have a whole lot of information about it. We've got some declassified documents that came out, shortly after that, and that's it. We have nothing else. McGuire Air Force Base. Oh, looks like I have a typo there. Is that a crash retrieval? Well, yeah, I think it is. It does appear that McGuire, this is in New Jersey. This is the event in which a U.S. Army military policeman apparently shot dead an alien being. It's an incredible story. The main person who has really talked a lot about this is U.S. Air Force retired Major George Filer, a man that I think is just a legend in our field. Great guy. I still publish his Filer's files every week or every other week, by the way. So wonderful. But George was assigned to McGuire Air Force Base in 1978. Has a lot to say about this. And by the way, he's not the only data point that we have on the McGuire Air Force Base incident. I've written about this at length in my second volume of UFOs and the National Security State. Dolan, of course, is in Russia, the Soviet Union, back in 1986. A heck of a case. And I'll just mention, just offhand, here in the Rochester area, Tracy and I ran into a gentleman who served in the Soviet military back during that period of time. And each of us, in talking, were shocked about the other. I was shocked that he was at Dolan in 1986. He was shocked that I'd ever heard of the name of the city. He's like, you know about Dolan? I was like, yes, I do. And we had a very interesting conversation about this. He was not present at the retrieval of the object there, but he said, I was there. And he said, I know exactly the area you're talking about. That whole area was cleared. The forest in that region was cleared. It had just recently been cleared. And obviously something important went on there, but he wasn't part of the inside operation to retrieve that technology. But that does appear. That's a fascinating case. And it looks like one of certainly more than one Russian retrievals of UAP technology. So it is important to remind ourselves that the United States is not the only game in town when it comes to these things. So let me talk a little bit about just a couple of these. I will talk about Cape Girardeau. It is a fascinating case. It's not as strong in terms of witness testimony as, say, Roswell is. Roswell, we have many, many people talking about this. Cape Girardeau, we really have one person, and that is Charlotte Mann. I happen to know Charlotte Mann, and I've spoken with her on a number of occasions, as have other researchers. I must say she is an absolutely wonderful person. You can't help but really like Charlotte. There's no question about her honesty. And in fact, there's one video that's out there somewhere. I don't have my copy of it here, but where she's with her sister talking to an interviewer about this event. But Charlotte's really the main person here. So she's been, Leonard Stringfield, pardon me, was the first person to interview her, but others also spoke to Charlotte. Her story is that her grandfather was a man named William Huffman, um, who was a reverend minister, and he received a phone call uh, that by local authorities to come and to pray over of victims of some kind of crash. And by the way, Charlotte got this story from her grandmother uh, before she died. So her grandmother knew this story from her husband and tells it now to her granddaughter Charlotte. This is how the whole thing came about. Anyway, you had police, FBI, emergency crew were there. We have stories that there was a strange craft with hieroglyphic-like writings. Sounds familiar. This is a drawing or two drawings that you see that apparently there was a photograph that existed that described the kind of scene you see on the top right. We've seen this type of photograph out there. It's out on the web, in different web searches, in different versions. Are any of them true? Is really the question. I suspect, the old expression, where there's smoke, there's fire. I think that we have enough smoke in this that there is probably some fire. But I mean, having said all of that, this is not the strongest case you're going to find. Nevertheless, there's enough here that when I look at it, I will just say to you, I think this probably happened. And if it did happen, let's just think a little bit about this. We have claims, for example, that a lot of our advanced technology came from UFO crashes, and many people have pointed to the invention of the transistor, which is 1947. That's the year of Roswell. And I mean, it just seems like it's too short a period of time to credit the invention of the transistor to Roswell. I mean, they're happening at the same time. Doesn't make sense. There was a good study, however, by Dr. Bob Wood, who looked into this matter and did, I think, do a really nice job at connecting some of the technology that went into the transistor, not to Roswell, but to Cape Girardeau. He actually even traced out the places where the transistor was developed logistically, fairly close to Cape Girardeau in some cases, and looking at the timelines and so forth. And I mean, is it possible? Yes, I think it's absolutely possible. Will we ever really know for sure? You're talking about corporate secrecy here. And I mean, it's not difficult, frankly, to see how something like that could just be brushed aside and hidden in the story of how this thing was invented. I mean, it doesn't seem like a difficult thing from my point of view. So anyway, that's Cape Girardeau. Let's go to Roswell. I want to do a little bit of something that, 10, 15 years ago, we used to do more often, and we almost never, no one ever talks about Roswell anymore. Not in as like what happened, what actually happened. Back in the 90s, Roswell was all the rage. Everyone was talking about Roswell. In the build up to the 1997 50th anniversary, my goodness, the whole UFO community was talking about it. I was still totally unknown, but I was deep in the research of UFOs, and I was following this as well. But I think, in the last decade, certainly, we don't really talk much about Roswell. It's kind of done. We're kind of Roswelled out. But look, this is an important case. And I just want to go over a little bit of the timeline just to remind you of how amazing this case actually is and was. So it starts with this man here, Mac Brazel. That's a picture of him. He was a sheep herder. He was foreman of a ranch called the Foster Ranch, owned by a family named Fosters. And he's out there on July 5th, Saturday, and he finds crash debris. As I indicate here on this slide, there's metal and there's beams that are plastic-like. And I say plastic-like because you couldn't bend or break these things. We know the story. Very lightweight material all around. Imagine how bizarre this must have seemed, particularly in 1947. You're out on your horse, you see all this stuff on the ground, and you're like, what is this? He said there was string-like material, not string, foil. We all heard about the foil. You crumple it up and it comes right back to its original formula, its original way it was. Very lightweight, very strong. And he's like, wow, this is interesting. And he takes some of it and shows his neighbors. They're named the Proctors. They're like, wow, that's pretty cool. What are you going to do with it? I don't know. And he eventually calls the sheriff of Roswell, that man on the left named George Wilcox, calls him. He brings actually some of it to Wilcox's office very next day on Sunday. Wilcox is like, oh, wow, okay, looks like we got to deal with some kind of crash, dead people. So he sends two deputies out there. They never make it. And, we have to keep in mind, this is a big area. So we say Roswell, but in fact, the crash occurred 75 miles north of Roswell Army Airfield. It's out in the desert. I went out there one time way back in 2006 to the actual crash site, or what we think was, and there's just nothing out there. And in 1947, it was worse. Today there's little roads and pathways. I don't think there was anything like that back then. It was much more difficult. I remember chatting years ago with Stanton Friedman about this, and he said, I was talking with someone who came from the UK and said, I don't understand how, why no one would know about this. And Stan said, the state of New Mexico is bigger than your whole country. You got to understand, this is a big, big country in a huge area. And he said, yeah, that person, like, oh yeah, right, I realize. So there's a lot of territory out there. But anyway, so those deputies never make it to the crash site. But then we have Roswell Army Airfield gets involved. Wilcox, the sheriff, calls the base and he says, look, I tried to send some deputies out there. I don't really know. The deputies, by the way, did find a field of melted glass. Does that mean anything? Maybe it does. Not sure. It does indicate high heat that would have been able that would have had to be able to do that. It seemed anomalous to them, but that's all that they were able to find. So Wilcox calls the base, which is run by a colonel named William Blanchard. And by the way, the 509th bomb group was what it was at Roswell. That was the bomb group, as many people know, that did drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War. Same group. They were transferred to Roswell after the war. And that's so a very elite unit, if you would look at it that way, was at Roswell at the time. At the same time, this is something that's very seldom discussed or noted. I have always felt this is significant. General Nathan Twining, whom I talked about yesterday, who wrote the author of the famous memo from September of 1947. Here he is 2 months earlier. He's the head of Air Material Command at Wright Field. Very important. He's got 3 stars on his shoulder. He will later get 4. He flies to New Mexico that day and stays for the next 4 days. The reasoning was some kind of conference that he was supposed to attend, but I've always thought it's very, very unusual to get a man of this caliber. Just so happens by coincidence coming to the area at that time. I don't think that's a coincidence. Now, on the same day, it's Monday, July 7th, you have 3 men from our Roswell Army Airfield assigned to go out to the debris field. Go find this stuff. On the left, you see a young Captain Jesse Marcel. On the right, you see a young, I think it's Captain or Lieutenant Bill Rickett of counterintelligence. And in the center, we only have a later picture of this man, Sheridan Cavett. But in 1947, he was young, just like the other guys. They all were sent out. Cavett and Marcel were the 2 who actually went to the debris field together. Rickett stayed. He drove out there, but he did not go to the debris field. But Marcel and Cavett were there. Now, you'll notice that Cavett and Rickett have CIC after their names. That's counterintelligence. So they were working in a different unit than Captain Jesse Marcel. I think that's significant because years later, what you have is Marcel talks about the Roswell crash. He says, yes, no, we found something very exotic out there. Cavett never, ever, ever admitted that at all, ever. He was not ever helpful to investigators on this matter. And I think to the end of his days, maintained the party line on Roswell. But they go out there And this is what Marcel said years later to researchers who he spoke to. By the way, not simply Stanton Friedman, but also the organization APRO, run by Jim and Coral Lorenzen and their investigators, including a friend of mine, Alan Levine, who might be watching this. Alan's a very, very excellent researcher and was active with APRO at the time, and actually told me quite a lot about APRO's interactions with Jesse Marcel. So Marcel actually spoke with a number of researchers. In any case, what he said is that Mac Brazel takes him and Cavett out to the debris field. He said it was about 3/4 of a mile long, and it was about 200 to 300 feet wide. So pretty, it is as if a fairly large object skidded along the desert and cut a path into the ground. He said there was a deep gouge that was about 500 feet long. Debris was as thin as newsprint. He said it was incredibly strong. One soldier later told Marcel that you couldn't bend it even by a sledgehammer. The foil, when it crumbled, returned to its shape. All this, which I've just talked about. I-beams with odd symbols. And you could get the beams to flex a tiny bit, and that's it. And as Marcel said years later, it certainly wasn't anything built by us. What's interesting about this is, I've always found interesting, is that in all of the descriptions of what Marcel had to say, you don't get a description of an actual flying saucer. Where is that thing? Did it lift up? Did it crash, pick up, and then crash somewhere else farther away that people were not immediately able to find? I would say probably. That's probably what did happen. So all that day, Monday, July 7th, Marcel and Cavett are out in the field, and they each have a Jeep. They're throwing their debris, as much as they can, into a Jeep to take back. And Marcel, at 2 a.m. on the early morning of Tuesday, July 8th, before he gets back to the base, he stops at his house and wakes up his family. It's really kind of interesting because I could imagine that in today's military protocols, like, you could just never do this. But I think back then, if things were a little different, the culture was a little different, was a lot different. And Marcel just thought, I'm showing this to my family. And so he did. He woke them up. And his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who's there on the right, as a much older man, of course, Jesse Jr. was 11 years old in 1947. And of course, it's spoken in great detail over many years about this. Jesse Jr. passed away just a few years ago, a really good man. Served himself long-standing time in the United States military. But anyway, Jesse shows this to his family. They get a little bit of an interesting surprise there. And then in the next morning, he and arrive at the air base with 2 carloads of debris. Colonel Blanchard notifies the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas. That is under the command of General Roger Ramey, a significant person in the UFO cover-up as well. Anyway, Blanchard tells Marcel, you're going to bring your debris to Fort Worth, Texas, to General Ramey. Meanwhile, they make the announcement that there's Walter Hout, who is the public information officer at Roswell. He actually typed it out on Blanchard's orders. And kind of an amazing thing, like, they're telling the world. The intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. Holy smokes, they actually made this announcement. Kind of amazing. And the phone calls, you have the people talking after the fact saying, oh my God, our phones were absolutely going out of control. We were getting calls one after the next, including, by the way, warnings from Washington telling them, you're gonna stop this announcement. You're gonna pull this out. There were threats that came in right away. Meanwhile, at the very same time, Marcel's flying out to Fort Worth, and here's poor Jesse Marcel holding debris of a weather balloon for photographers, for the photographer there. And he said, look, I left the room, I came back in, the debris was switched out with all of this stuff, and I just had to suck it up, take the orders, and pose for the pictures. There was a lot of support of Jesse Marcel of that, by the way. I think I mentioned yesterday, Colonel, later General Thomas Dubose, who was Ramey's chief of staff, who said the exact same thing years later. He said, oh yeah, that whole thing was switched out. And then, you bring in the press, you give them the story they want, you basically hand deliver it, and the press, led by, of course, the New York Times, always does the work of the establishment and the military state, just saying, yeah, just a weather balloon. Everyone go back to sleep. And that's it. And then until 30 years later, there's an older Jesse Marcel, there's Stanton Friedman, Bill Moore, who was very, very active in researching Roswell at that time, writes the book, The Roswell Incident, which Stanton Friedman contributed to, even though he didn't get really an author credit. So the book came out after Marcel was essentially rediscovered and was willing to talk about it. And that got us off to the races with Roswell. So, it's an interesting story. I think we and there's so much more with Roswell. I've written in a lot of detail about the Roswell event in my books, as have many other authors. I'm a big fan of the book by Donald Schmidt and Tom Carey, Witness to Roswell, probably the definitive work on Roswell at this time. But there's a lot of other very good ones. The thing about Roswell that I think is worth restating again is simply the number of witnesses who have a genuine, legitimate connection to that event that have come forward to talk about it. It's very difficult to deny. You talk about where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, in the case of Roswell, there's just so much. It's like the smoke of a forest fire is really what we are able to see here. Yeah, we could just go on and on about Roswell, but we're gonna move on, and I want to talk briefly about secrecy, the secrecy machinations, and then I'm going to go back to more crash retrieval information. We're going to talk about Stringfield in a bit, but what I would encourage you to do is just use some historical imagination here. Go back in time and pretend that you're the president. You're Harry Truman, that man on the right there. Next to Truman there, incidentally, is his Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, who, boy, I've talked a lot about Forrestal over the years. I do firmly believe Forrestal was not a suicide, but was murdered. He was, I think, thrown out of the 16th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1949. You want to learn more about that, go to my website. I talk about that quite a bit. I may have a couple of videos on YouTube about that as well. But anyway, imagine you're Truman, and it's brought to your attention that this is real. The Roswell event happened. And in fact, this whole UFO thing was real. These things were buzzing our air bases. They were flying around. We did not know who they were, what's going on. Your head of the nation had just fought the Second World War and won the Second World War. You're sitting on top of the world. You've got 5% of the world's population, but 50% of the world's money, the world's GDP. The United States at the end of World War II had half of the world's GDP. Couldn't get better. And then suddenly you're given this information. You're like, oh my goodness, what do I do about this? Do I tell the world? Well, your people would say, that's a bad idea, sir. Very bad idea. Think about the state of the world in 1947. You've got a situation in which the United States had a monopoly of atomic bombs. The Soviet Union, the Russians, they were working on it, but they did not yet have a nuclear weapon. That would not happen until 1949. So in 1947, America was the only nation in the world that had nuclear weapons. And it was a very big issue at the time as to whether or not the U.S. should share or have under international control the knowledge about what it possessed relating to atomic nuclear technology. America's answer was, no, thank you. We're not sharing that, not at all. That's the quickest way to give this to the Russians. We're just not willing to do that. So I've often wondered if the Americans were not willing to share atomic secrets with the world, can we really expect that they would be wanting to share something as exotic as ET tech? And I think the answer is clearly no. They're not going to be willing to share that technology, not with the Russians, not with anybody in 1947. It's too much that's unknown. But then you've got social concerns. Um, Sometimes this can get overplayed. In the late 1930s, we remember Orson Welles, the filmmaker, created a radio play, War of the Worlds, that did cause some level of panic. Some people have argued not so much as people say, but I think there was some panic, and in fact, that was very much on the mind of analysts at the time. But the real question is, if you're Truman, do you tell the world about this when you yourself don't really know? What is the answer? Are these beings a threat? Are they not a threat? This is all new to you. Uh, how will the public react? You don't know the answer to this. This is a huge unknown. And then you know, just asking yourself, how do we deal with this secrecy for now? For now, you could say, well, it's just going to be a temporary thing. We're going to figure this out, and maybe 10 years from now, we'll be able to tell the world. Of course, what happens is you develop runaway secrecy. Secrecy is like a drug. It develops its own power, its own momentum, its own reason to be, its own wealth. And I think that is what exactly happened here. You have a situation where, uh, Truman clearly sits down with his top people and he says, all right, we have to make a plan here. You're going to be in charge of having people study this technology so that we can figure out what this is and what we can do with it and so forth. You're going to be in charge of managing the media. You have to make sure that all of the correct narratives go out to the media because we don't really want people snooping around in this. You're going to study the social implications. How bad might the public panic be if this information comes out? And on and on and on. You put your team together. You develop a methodology by which you can segue the technology to private industry because that's really where you need it to go. In the United States, it's all about private industry. That's where the science is. That's where the money is. And so that has to be all worked out. A system has to be put into place that is under very, very tight classified control. That's what we have here. And what it really did, what I would suggest to you, is that this created a two-class society. That is the very few who had access to this and the very great many who did not. And really, I think that's what we are still dealing with to this very day, all these years later, almost 80 years later, this runaway secrecy creating this type of a situation. And of course, the problem with all of these types of secrets is that the longer they go, uh, in many cases, you can see the more difficult it becomes to reveal it. It's one thing to say, yeah, we kept this secret for about 5 years because we just really needed to, get on top of it. But what do you say about something that's been secret for 80 years? How do you tell the public that this is for your own good? That becomes a very difficult scenario, particularly when you're the United States that has this pretense of being this ultra honest, above board. We're the good guys. We wear the white hats. But yeah, oh yeah, we lied to you. We lied to the entire world about this most important of events, and we dominated our allies. We controlled them so that they wouldn't talk about it, and we just are making sure that you don't know about it. We did this for 80 years, and also made a lot of money in the process. For some of our private contractors undoubtedly had a golden goose here. Yeah, sorry about that, but well, what can you do? No, this is really not, it's not a good look for the United States, particularly, I would just add, in the current climate when you are never supposed to believe in any conspiracy theories ever for the rest of all time. Those are considered bad. But here, for the United States now to admit that really, literally, the greatest conspiracy of all time, that one happened to be true. Yeah, the UFO conspiracy, that's the true one. How easy will it be for the United States government and then to say, don't believe in these other conspiracies, like the JFK or 9/11 or COVID or whatever else you want to get into? Uh, yeah, you really lose a lot of credibility. And so it's a real problem. That's the problem with longstanding runaway secrecy. So how do you manage the secret? Well, as I suggest here, you do a few things. You create black budgets. Black budget is simply spending that Congress authorizes that they do not know where it's going. That's not supposed to be the case. The United States Constitution is not designed like that. It's not supposed to authorize all of this secret spending, but that is exactly what happened. The Manhattan Project, which built the atomic bomb, was one model for what became a kind of black budget ecosystem. And one thing that I think students of the black budget need to understand, which I think they generally don't, is the central place that the UFO phenomenon played in the creation of a black budget culture in the United States. I think it was a very important part of it. Not the only part, but certainly important. So you have secret spending. And then you have what we can call layers of secrecy. That is programs nested within programs. If you studied the Davis-Wilson notes, which I was very active in discussing when they were made public in 2019, because I read them, I read parts of them back in 2006, 2006, yes. You find that when Wilson went to look for the special access programs dealing with ET tech and acquisition, they were nested within special access programs, like the Russian matryoshka eggs. One egg inside another inside another. That is exactly how it operated, and that's great for secrecy. You have programs within programs, and the reason is that if your program were to be exposed, you could say, no, 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 it's not this program. It's this other higher level program that it's nested within, and you say that's what people are talking about. It is good for secrecy. So you do that. You also have to dominate major media. If you want to maintain the secret, you must control what was then mainstream media, i.e. radio and newspapers, later television, and then later internet. You must control academia and science. These are a lot easier than people think. A lot of very naive, well-meaning academicians, they think, well, yeah, academia is a place where all of the ideas are battled out in the open, everything's open source. No, it's not that way at all. There's so much classified science that goes on, which is dependent upon funding, by the way. And so, no, it's all a lot of it can be controlled, and the UFO phenomenon was definitely controlled. And then you certainly need teams to study this technology and all the implications of the phenomena. You have to create your secrecy group. It's a pretty involved thing. The last thing I'll say about runaway secrecy before I come back to crash retrieval info, there are two, I would say, classic articles. This is all pre-2017, pre-current era of UAP, that shed a lot of light on how the black budget system operates. One was written by Bill Sweetman for Jane's International Defense Review back in 2000. And this is a really fascinating article, and I guess I'll just leave it there. Go check it out. He really talks about how private contractors really dominate the world of special access program. He says this back in 2000, really early. He says there doesn't appear to be almost any significant oversight of these programs by the DoD itself. And that, I think, was shown to be true in the Davis-Wilson notes. I've often wondered, and I don't know for sure, how much Bill Sweetman knew about the Davis Wilson scenario, or actually the Thomas Wilson scenario itself in 2000. Would he have known about it? And I think he may have. I don't know. It's just a hunch. Another good article, which actually shockingly came out in the Washington Post, a 3-part series back in 2010 by Dana Priest and Bill Arkin. Very good, just called Top Secret America. It's probably searchable. I think it's a very good follow-up to some of the work Sweetman did. All of this leads to what I have often called a breakaway civilization. Is this a real thing? I'm never going to say that I know for a fact that the breakaway civilization is real, but I think it is. What you can think of it as a kind of invisible empire. What is a civilization? Do we really know how to quantify what constitutes a genuine civilization? Well, maybe not, but we have a feel for it. It includes your level of technology. It includes the manner of your social interactions with each other and the world. And it certainly must include your cosmology or your view of the world itself. All of these make up what your civilization is. And I would just submit to you that if you have a classified scenario in which a small group of individuals have access to the reality of alien tech, alien bodies, the alien reality, and you are then therefore able to build a technological infrastructure to some extent based on that, you're going to have massive advantages that the rest of the world is going to lack. Particularly if you classify those technologies and make it literally illegal for people to engage in research in there. And so you're off on the fast track. Everyone else is being held behind. Do you have a separate civilization, one that is broken away from the mainstream civilization? And I would submit, yeah, you can, that can be argued, yes. Now, how far does this go is the question. How magical, how advanced is the technology? This, I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer here, but I do think we can talk about a significant infrastructure that is, maybe it's underground, somehow off the grid in some important ways, that makes them separate. Are they on the moon? Are they on Mars? Don't know. Don't really know if I have a way of understanding the reality one way or the other about that. I do think that we have developed some very advanced tech that probably do give us some ability to leave the planet. That might include something like, which I'll talk about tomorrow, the alien reproduction vehicle, and maybe other advanced types of craft that we might have been able to develop. That's going to come tomorrow. Talk about Boeing, talk about Lockheed, and so forth. So that's what a breakaway civilization is. So I look at it as a hypothesis, as a theory, and I leave it for you to think about on your own. Let's talk about some more of these whistleblowers, and I'm going to really focus on Stringfield here for the most part, not exclusively. Stringfield is, just so important here. So he developed many connections from a variety of sources. And as I say, well over 100 that he spoke to and cultivated. And again, I would encourage you to go through his book and read these accounts and just see how he developed this information. I think it's quite persuasive. One of them was a doctor. Stringfield knew this man personally. He met him personally. He spoke with him a number of times. Starting in 1978. He called him Dr. X in his articles, and he said he works at a major hospital somewhere on the eastern seaboard of the United States, did not identify which one it was, but a man who gave Stringfield a lot of information about the anatomy of these alien beings. He described them as about 4 feet tall, weighed about 40 pounds, large head, and with a heavy brow ridge. I find that interesting because that actually goes against the trend of human evolution, where human ancestors did traditionally have a heavy brow ridge, and we don't have that heavy brow ridge the way our ancestors did. But a brow ridge, really, when you think of it physiologically, is not an inhibitor to prominent brain. And it is conceivable to me that you could have an alien with a large head and a brow ridge. Not sure what the purpose of that would be and why it would be there. So that's a little bit of an anomaly to me when I look at it. He said the eyes were round with no pupils, apertures instead of ears, tiny nose. These are descriptions that we get that are very gray alien-like. He said the mouth was like a slit that appeared to be non-functional. So how are they getting food? The feet did not have distinct toes, but a fusion of small bones. Very kind of odd. You look at, this is a drawing that Stringfield did, and he submitted to the doctor. He says, this is accurate. The doctor said, yeah, that's actually pretty good. There's webbing between the fingers you see there, by the way, which might indicate an aquatic connection. Is that what they are? That doesn't look like a creature that would do particularly well in the water. In fact, one thing you notice about a creature like this is that how could it possibly ever be born naturally of another being of its own kind? I actually would think it's impossible. That head is just too big. Look, women have it tough enough in childbirth. Can you imagine, seriously, a female alien gray, if that's what this is, giving birth to a baby version of that? I can't see that it's possible. The head is so large. However, could this be true nonetheless? And certainly it could be true if you posit that these are artificially engineered and grown in capsules, whatever. We're talking about this now for our own society, right? So once you don't have the restriction of a birth canal um, inhibiting the size that a cranium can be, could you engineer an exceptionally large brain that would give you a lot of extra brain power that could be quite useful? Brains are expensive, we all know, in terms of the body's nutrition, but if you figure out a method by doing it, well, it could perhaps work really effectively. So to me, I look at all gray aliens as biologically engineered. They can be biological. They're not fully artificial, but they are engineered and undoubtedly grown, not born. Let me move on here. Some of the Stringfield's other contacts I mentioned, he talked about the Kingman crash. His connection for that was a man named Arthur Stansel, who went under the pseudonym Fritz Werner back then, but his name was Arthur Stansel. He was an engineer. He had very good credentials. And this man actually spoke at great length to Ray Fowler, as I mentioned earlier. He said that he worked on the retrieval of a crashed alien disc. He said he was taken with other specialists. It was a large group in blacked out buzzes to a desert site where he saw a 30-foot wide saucer embedded in the sand and a dead alien that was 3 to 4 feet tall inside a tent. Very interesting. Another crash that Stringfield came across, not Las Vegas, but New Mexico. It sounds a little bit similar to the Las Vegas crash, and I've sometimes wondered. This is information from another UFO researcher named Robert Barry, who just said, yeah, there's an object tracked on military radar across the southwestern states before crashing somewhere in New Mexico. Now, the fact is that the Las Vegas event that Kevin Randall talked about was tracked going across the entire United States, but it was being tracked also over the southwestern states. And I have sometimes wondered if they're talking about the same event. Hard to know, but maybe. Or maybe this is a completely separate event. How many of these crashes occurred? Let me just stop and deal with the occasional objection that you hear from skeptics. They'll say, well, if these aliens are so advanced, they can come across from galaxies, why do they crash all the time? They somehow lose their ability to have a controlled descent. Well, yes, maybe, actually. It's entirely possible. But also what we don't realize is how many alien craft are there to begin with. We have a pretty advanced infrastructure with our airlines, and yet we do have airplane crashes. Still happens. People still die from them. And if you were to go back in time to talk to people of, I don't know, ancient Greece and say, yeah, we've got these aircraft and they can fly all over the world, they'd be like, oh my God, that's incredible. They might be incredulous that any of our aircraft crash at all, because they would think, well, you're so advanced, how could you possibly crash them? Look at all that you're able to do. And yet we do, we have them. And simply because an alien civilization seems to be so much farther ahead than us does not mean that they are omnipotent or omniscient and infallible. I think that's a misconception, particularly if you have a situation where perhaps there's some hostilities. We have scrambled Air Force interceptors on many occasions, as have the Russians. And so there's some trouble in paradise there. It's not clear that all goes always well for these other beings. So they can have mishaps. I don't think that's outrageous at all. Stringfield came across another case at Fort Riley, Kansas. This was a landing, maybe a retrieval. Hard to know with some of these because you get a lot of partial information. It's from 1964. A witness Stringfield spoke to said, I was assigned at guard duty at a scene. I saw a general there, and we were trying to figure out, is this a human thing or is this an alien thing? And that's all this guy knew. Other retrievals, Stringfield wrote at great length about somewhere in the southwestern U.S. in 1957, alien bodies. One of the more interesting ones from Wright-Patterson, 1966, a man who was doing a security detail there said that I told his wife there were 9 alien bodies that I saw there, and I learned that there were 30 bodies at the base in total, 30 bodies at Wright-Pat. He said there was a craft at the base too. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about June Crane, the administrative assistant who worked at Wright-Pat. She had a lot to say about this as well. One of the more interesting things Stringfield came across was a conversation with a radar specialist who worked at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey in 1953. This is kind of not quite an alien autopsy film, but it was a film of a dead alien, where he said, look, this is the craziest story. He goes to Stringfields in the late 70s, said about 25 years ago, I was a young guy working there, and I was told to appear at this military theater. Okay, so he goes in, and he's with a few other people there. The lights go out, and this film goes on, and he is shown a scene in some desert location. There's a crashed UFO, and there's a tent where there's a dead alien body in this tent. He's looking at this thinking, what am I even looking at? Next thing he knows, the film is over, the lights in the theater go on, and they're all told to leave. He's not given a debriefing, nothing. It's totally confusing. 2 weeks later, as he told Stringfield, he said, this intelligence officer on the base came up to me and said, that film you saw 2 weeks ago, that was a hoax. Forget it. And the guy said, ever since then, I wondered, what happened? What was this all about? What was I exposed to? And indeed, it's a really good question. What was he exposed to? Well, we may never know, but it's worth speculating that maybe he failed a test. If you are in 1953 and you're in charge of recruiting individuals for a UFO, UAP crash retrieval situation, you have to find out, who can I rely on? Who is handling this information the way that I need them to? And it's entirely possible that this man just maybe flunked the test in some way. Maybe he reacted too emotionally. Maybe he told a friend. Maybe he did something that indicated he's not reliable. And so they just said, nope, you're not in. And maybe that's what happened. We don't know, but I just put that out there because it strikes me as one plausible scenario. A couple of other things. We'll just go through this quickly. I see that I am running short on time here. Other individuals who saw alien bodies at Wright-Patt. Again, Wright-Patt is an Air Force base. Oh, this is an interesting one. Stringfield got to talk with an Air Force intelligence officer through a mutual acquaintance. I forget the details of how this worked out, but it was kind of convoluted. Gets to talk to this guy and says, yeah, back in 1948, I didn't see a crash, but I saw a top secret document about a UFO crash somewhere in New Mexico in which the craft was retrieved and the bodies were retrieved. So that's an interesting data point. And this one I have here, a lieutenant colonel tells Stringfield, he said, I have detailed knowledge about underground installations. And he specifically talked about one at Fort Hood in Texas, but other bases as well, where there are these squadrons of unmarked helicopters that are dispatched to areas of UFO activity, including airlift operations. I just want to point out in my I'm currently researching hundreds and thousands of UFO reports all the time for my current book project, but just in general, I read UFO reports a lot. And what you do find frequently, even to this day, into this decade, are individuals who say, I saw this very bizarre craft, and then 15 minutes later or a half hour later, a couple of black or unmarked helicopters are in the area, and sometimes with spotlights, searchlights, and like they're clearly engaged in some kind of operation. So I think this is a policy that continues to this day, whatever that entails. I do want to talk about the Smith-Sarbacher-Walker story. This is one of the most fascinating stories in all of UFO history. And in the time that I have here, let me just go over this. Wilbur Smith is the man on the top left there. He was a Canadian government scientist, really interesting guy. He's very highly intelligent, into UFOs, deep into UFOs, into the contactee element of UFOs as well, but also into the technology. And he, in 1950, he's down in D.C. Within the Canadian embassy, and he makes a point to speak to the man who's to the right of him, Dr. Robert Sarbacher. He arranges a meeting with Sarbacher. And it'd be interesting to know how he knew about him. But anyway, they have a conversation about these flying saucers. And in the aftermath of his conversation with Sarbacher, he writes to his own supervisor in the Canadian government and says, I learned that this is the most highly classified subject in the United States, flying saucers, higher than the hydrogen bomb project, which was pretty high up there. So that memo becomes available in the 1970s, but we don't know who Smith's contact was. Then the man on the bottom right there, Arthur Bray, a wonderful Canadian researcher, standing next to a young version of me back in, I think, 2006, that was 2005. Uh, Arthur Bray is doing research on Wilbert Smith's papers. This is after Smith died. Finds in Smith's handwritten papers uh, that identify who the scientist was that he spoke to, and he discovers it's Robert Sarbacher. Sarbacher was still alive. So the word gets out, and a bunch of researchers find Sarbacher. Stanton Friedman's found Sarbacher. But the real researcher who was able to pry out a lot of information was William Steinman, and got a 2-page type memo, a letter from Sarbacher talking in great detail about this. And Sarbacher saying, yeah, this actually was real. We understood that the technology in this was incredibly advanced. He said Vannevar Bush was involved. Also, he mentioned Dr. John von Neumann, he said was definitely involved. For those of you who don't know, von Neumann was probably the greatest mathematical genius of the 20th century. Absolute, like alien level of intelligence. Von Neumann was just incredible. So he was involved. A lot of these other brilliant geniuses were involved, possibly Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, actually Sarbacher mentioned, and so on. Probably all of that is true. But Sarbacher also, in a telephone conversation not long before he died, mentioned the name of Dr. Eric Walker. He said, I wasn't at the meetings where these crash retrievals were discussed, but Eric Walker was. You can find him if he's willing to talk to you. You might be able to get some information. Shortly after that, Sarbacher died. So now the chase goes on to Walker, and a number of researchers found Dr. Eric Walker. This man had been president of Penn State University, but more importantly, was head of a very important think tank, the Institute for Defense Analyses, a very, very high-level individual here. And Walker, we're talking now late 1980s. Walker is when the MJ-12 documents came out. Things were a little unsettled. And Walker, who knows why, talked to some of these researchers, in particular Bill Steinman, but also others as well, and spilled some beans. I don't know how else you can put it. I wrote about this at length in my second volume of UFOs in the National Security State. Grant Cameron, excellent researcher, wrote a lot about this as well in one of his books. And you go check it out. It's an amazing story. So what you have here is this trail of breadcrumbs, essentially, that leads from Smith to Sarbacher. Arthur Bray finds a key piece of information, and it leads to Walker. And all of this is an incredible confirmation of the UFO crash retrieval reality. Walker not only confirmed retrievals of these objects, but also confirmed the reality of a group like MJ-12. He said to the researcher, look, you're getting into areas you have no business getting into this. Just get out. Just stop asking about it. So, heck of a story. That's Walker. Just leave it alone. Leave it alone. And we come up to David Grush. So this is last summer. Now, look, there are a number of many other crash retrieval data points between David Grush, who we only learned about last summer, and many of the other people I've spoken about. And I don't have time to go into all of them. It's too many. But they tell a consistent story of ongoing acquisition of this technology and of these bodies. So now we have Grush. So what was David Grush? What's his story? Most of us have a pretty good idea, but he was an intelligence official. He was but he was a member of the UAP task force back in 2019. If you remember, this was assigned by Congress as a body that would be in charge of collecting UAP data from different areas within the Defense Department and the government. And so Grush's job, he already had very high security clearances at that point. His job was to interview these individuals to get information about it. And that's what he did. And what he clearly, quickly realized was that the Department of Defense was engaging in tremendous obstruction of his own job and of the individuals that were coming to him. And he complained about it and got a lot of pushback and a lot of illegal pushback, as he put it, and issued a formal complaint with the Inspector General of the intelligence community. And that's what really got him known. So what does David Grush have to say? Well, this is all through his interviews. In a sense, you could say he was doing essentially what Leonard Stringfield was doing, meeting with people, talking with individuals who had important information to say about this subject, with the difference being that as a United States government, in his U.S. government capacity, these individuals lying to him would be a much more dangerous proposition. It's one thing if a person wants to lie to Leonard Stringfield, but if you're going to lie to David Grush in this capacity in the UAP task force, you're engaging in serious law breaking. It's a much greater and graver transgression. So keep that in mind. Grush, in his brief period of time doing this, spoke to 40, he said, individuals who had information on this. Quite a lot. And what did he say? He said, look, some of these individuals are Nobel caliber individuals with incredible security backgrounds and so forth. He says, look, you have to take what they're saying seriously. And I have learned through them and many of the other people I've spoken to that we have multiple craft of non-human origin. I think he said something about a dozen or so, several that were in very good condition, others that were damaged and so forth. He also talked about the non-human biologics. That's where that phrase comes in from David Grush. The biologics. That is alien bodies or alien beings or alien biological samples in one form or another that the United States government or its private contractors have possession of. And, the amazing thing about this is that Grush isn't just saying this to journalists, like he spoke to Ross Coulthard, he spoke to Leslie Kahn and Ralph Blumenthal for articles, spoke to other people subsequently. He did all of that, but he also said it to Congress, to a live in-session hearing before the world with a lot of cameras on him. That's something that's never happened before. We have not ever been in this situation. Really kind of an amazing thing. It was shocking to the world. I will just emphasize that to those of us who have been researching the UFO phenomenon for any period of time, particularly crash retrievals, what David Grush had to say is very much in line with what we, from our perspective, have been talking about as well. So some of these entities, he said, might be dead and alive. I don't think he was especially, certain, or he didn't give a lot of detailed information. And a lot of times, of course, members of Congress would say, well, can you give us more information? He said, look, I can't. I'm walking the line here. If I go 1 inch beyond, I could go to jail. And that's real, right? I think we can recognize that's for real. He offered to talk in a SCIF, that is a sensitive compartmented information facility, was not able to do that. And there was a SCIF update that happened to members of Congress, and many of you heard Tim Burchett, congressman, say wasn't very impressive. And by the way, there's going to be another such classified briefing on Friday, January 12th, in just a couple of days from right now. Whether we will get information about that or not is a whole other story, but that is said to be happening in a couple of days as of today. And then the last thing, of course, Grush said, is that the U.S. government's been involved in reverse engineering alien tech. And, from my perspective, I'm like, yeah, no kidding, but it's very good that this was said in public. Lots of criticisms against him because he didn't provide the actual alien technology. I don't know what else to say. I think he went as far as he was able to go. Now, let's talk about implications, and then I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time to answer a couple of questions that are being collected here. What are the implications? Well, I've got 2 pages of this, so and this just gets us started. But A, advanced tech. Obviously, if these retrievals are real, then the U.S. military and most likely other global powers, i.e. Russia, probably China too, would have access to some advanced tech beyond our current capabilities. Could be in propulsion, could be in material science, could be in anything else that we can think about. Reverse engineering. Yes, have we been working on duplicating what way they have? Well, I'm going to talk much more about that tomorrow, but short answer, I think, is yes. Existence of ET life. It's a basic implication, but worth reminding ourselves of. It means we're not alone. We're here. We're not the apex of the universe. We're a link in the chain. We're a point on the web of the universe, of the interstellar web of life. Still interesting, but it would require a reorientation, obviously. Another implication is the existence of deep, deep, and probably illegal and very likely criminal government secrecy on this whole matter, which leads to a whole other array of implications there. The impact on our society, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of days in more detail, but obviously it's tremendous. And then you think about how much money has been spent on this. I'll talk about this tomorrow. Short answer, I think a great amount of money has been spent on this, and we probably want to know about that. The international implications, I'm going to get into this as well in the last two subsequent lectures I have, but there's a whole international aspect of UFO secrecy and crash retrieval secrecy as well that a whole behind the scenes Cold War. Grush actually talked a little bit about this, the desire for all of the parties involved to weaponize the ET technology, and that should not surprise us. Legal questions, ethical questions. Who gets the money from the tech? Can there be lawsuits involved by defense contractors that are left out of the loop? You're talking about unfair business practices, perhaps? Yeah, perhaps. Scientific implications are immense. And then the threat implication. Is this a threat or not a threat? We all have our own opinions on this, but I would just say if you're working in the intelligence field or in military, your job is to assess this as a potential threat. You're supposed to do. If you're not doing that, you're not doing your job. And a potential threat, well, of course, a potential threat. Of course, it could be a potential bit as well. But these are questions that need to be hashed out in public. I don't have a whole lot of time. I'm sorry that I went a little bit over. I apologize. But why don't we bring Jim on board, and you can ask, he can ask any of the questions that we have time for. I'm very happy to do. So thanks for being here with me on that one.
Thank you so much, Richard. Fascinating, the level of detail that has been brought into the public domain by researchers like Stringfield and others. And there's a lot of fascination in our chat about the alien bodies and the work of the doctor who actually did the autopsies, and your remark that
he had to disappear. He disappeared on Stringfield. I didn't even get to mention that here, but he wrote to Stringfield or communicated with him after he had given a kind of important data drop there and said, I just had my knuckles wrapped or smacked. I can't talk with you any longer. And he just ended their whole communication. So he had higher ups that learned that he was communicating with Stringfield, and he just essentially became a ghost.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah.
Well, there was some speculation noting that in that drawing that the being had nipples, and wondering, what that meant in light of what you were saying, that their heads were so big, there was probably no vaginal birth.
So
As
why
we
nipples?
understand it, and if they're artificial intelligence constructs, as you see in some of the movies where they're kind of incubated in these containers, like an Avatar, for example, how would all that kind of work?
Well,
Based on everything what
yeah, we
your
want to keep
sense
in
of
want to
these
keep in
ET?
mind this is a drawing by Stringfield, not by the doctor.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, and I don't know how knowledgeable Leonard Stringfield was on physiology and things like that. So I don't know if the nipples were just him putting that in there or not. It is a good question to ask, like why, if it's an artificial construct, would you have something like that? It could be. I could imagine that these beings were taken from genuine biological organisms genetically, but perhaps there are limits as to how you can modify a biological organism for your own purposes. The nipples could be vestigial in some way, and it could be that the aliens weren't able to eliminate those nipples. I don't know, just speculating, but yeah, obviously it leads to many questions.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And the other cluster of questions was around the retrievals, and you did make the point about that air crashes happen in our domain, but if you think about the history of airplane crashes over the last 75, say 100 years, they get less and less and less and less and less.
That's right, especially in
When
the
one,
last 20 years, particularly.
yeah, when one thinks of the UFO phenomenon around the world, there have been an extraordinary number of crashes. So, I
Depends on
mean,
how you look at it.
how do you square that
Yeah.
circle?
It depends on how you look at it. So I actually looked into this. I have a couple of slides that I've created in the past on this. I've tried to really look at it mathematically. So I mean, when we fly in an aircraft, it's very safe. Your chances of dying in a crash, I think, are 1 in 11 million or something like that. But nonetheless, we have a lot of air traffic. We have a lot of air traffic, and we still have, even now. Uh, I think it's up. It may be 100 or more air crashes every year. It could be more than that. In the recent past, it was substantially more than that. That involved, fairly large numbers of fatalities each year. Hundreds of people would die in air crashes every year, and still do. I mean, we just had the crash in Japan where those people were miraculously, most of them were saved. It was incredible. So we do have our incidents. The real question with the ET question is how much ET traffic is there? If it's very little traffic and they're crashing, that's one thing. But if it's a tremendous amount of traffic that we're just not tracking, and they have a few now and then, that's another. Ryan Wood's book, he listed about 75 that took place in the 20th century. Seems like a lot. They may not all be legit crashes. Let's say 20 happened. 20 seems like a lot to us, but is it really, depending on how much traffic is actually going on? I don't know that that's all that much. It really depends on the amount of traffic that is happening. My own estimate, and again, I admit it's just my own speculative estimate, is that we're talking, uh, at least 50,000 good UFO sightings around the world every year. This is what I think. It's probably more than that. And how many UFOs are out there that we don't even see? Well, that's a tough question to answer by its very nature, but we have to assume there's much more traffic than we're even detecting. So I don't know if it's all that outrageous a proposition that every now and then one of them comes down.
Yes, it is, and we more than,
We just don't know.
and we're just taking in the data and the evidence, and because it's
Exactly.
so firmly repressed for so long, it's going to take probably maybe even decades before the full truth comes out. And when one thinks of the Kennedy assassination, now well over just about 60 years ago, still not revealed to the full light of public
No, that's right.
awareness, you get a sense of just how long and complicated these processes can be. And that leads, I think, to a final question for your comment. We've been repressing this, and yet we've now reached disclosure largely because of the whistleblowers like Lou Elizondo or David Grush. So one of the ironies is it's the people inside the military intelligence industrial complex that have actually been coming out and telling the public what it is that the public needs to know, David Grush being the most recent example. So I'd love to have your comment on, we often think of the military industrial complex as a monolithic edifice, sort of like a Stalinist regime. But the reality, I think, is that it's comprised of people with different levels of information, different levels of orientation to the information, and that even something as highly classified and held as the UFO phenomenon has still over time, in some sense, been betrayed by the very people who've been mandated to keep it secret. So speak about this
Yeah.
whistleblower phenomenon within the secrecy regime. It's been
I'm glad you
absolutely
brought this up.
crucial in the disclosure process.
Totally agree with everything there. It's very easy for people to forget that the military is a $1 trillion a year universe unto itself. It's a huge massive entity. It's sprawling with all of these different departments and competing groups within it. They don't all play nice in the sandbox with each other. There's been rivalry throughout the entire history, post-World War II history of the U.S. military, particularly regarding UFOs. We know for sure that there was a rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force over many aspects of UFO protocols and secrecy back in the 50s. It has always been the case. There's always been divergences of opinion on this matter. They were written about in some detail by Donald Kehoe in a number of his books way back then. We know about this. We know that there's always been divergences of opinion, that there have been people within the military who have often said, my oath is to the Constitution of the United States, and this secrecy, I believe, is not constitutional. Like, they've said this. And so there's been legitimate disagreement within the military. And so when folks like Elizondo came out in 2017, and it was one thing to hear smears against him by the Pentagon itself, which did that, but it was disheartening for me to hear people in the UFO community smearing him as some kind of CIA asset. He's promoting disinformation and nonsense like that. I don't know all of his covert connections. It's true, I don't. But what I can go on is what the man says.
Exactly.
And that's really all that we can ever do is judge what is someone saying. Is he speaking the truth or not? And he was speaking the truth. He does speak the truth. That's the fact. And does he have a different opinion from the hierarchy? Yes, it certainly does seem to be the case. Does he believe, do all of them believe in full disclosure, 100%? Don't know. They may not. Not clear to me. But it's obvious that within the establishment that there are obvious divergences of opinion. They have always existed. And you get this with all ruling elites throughout all of human history. They've always competed with each other. There's always divergences of opinion. It's just the name of the game. And we have it within the UFO secrecy structure as well. So yeah, I think we need to recognize that. And we may not agree with all of their opinion, whether it's Lou Elizondo or, I don't know, Chris Mellon or David Grush or whatever they think about other matters of national security or politics.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to agree with them on that. What we can do is take the truth that they are offering, the information,
Exactly,
check it as well as we can, and move on. And we owe them a lot, all of those individuals who have come forward to push this issue before the public the way they have. It was a lot of work. It wasn't an easy thing. And still, people will occasionally throw rotten tomatoes at them. And I just can't understand that. But I think we really owe them a lot of gratitude.
yes, yes. Well, thank you so much. As we close here, why don't you just tee us up for tomorrow? What can we
Sure.
expect for your third lecture?
We're going to get into the corporate aspect of this whole cover-up aspect of the UFO phenomenon. That is, does Lockheed have anything to do with this? Well, yes, I think they do. Does Boeing have anything to do with this? Yeah, I believe they do. Any other agencies? Yes, we will talk about them. Battelle Memorial Institute and a bunch of others that are involved behind the scenes in studying this technology. It's been basically what we can say is it's like a classified corporate gold rush. And I want to get into that. And I think that's a big part of the secrecy apparatus that we need to understand. Following that on the final day, I'm going to take a few steps back and try to look at the bigger picture of what are they? Who are these other beings actually? What are they doing? What can we think about that? So that's a whole other thing. But for tomorrow, we're going to go a little deeper into the secrecy scenario.
Thank you so much, Richard. This has been fascinating and deeply illuminating. So we'll see you all again here tomorrow on Humanity Rising. That'll do it for us for today. Everyone, you're all welcome to join Richard in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and then we'll deal with the corporate gold rush of reverse engineering tomorrow, which is an extraordinarily important part of the overall classified and very secret phenomenon that we're dealing with. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very
everyone.
much, Jim.
See you
Thanks,
tomorrow.
everybody.